Lamenting EU's geopolitical agenda, EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, has outlined four main tasks on EU's geopolitical agenda, which are, number one, supporting Ukraine, putting an end to the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, implementing the two-state solution, and lastly, improving ties with the global south. He also emphasized on how Europe is in danger with two wars on its doorstep. It's in extreme danger, further emphasizing on how the era of Western dominance has clearly ended. To talk more on this, we're now being joined by James Jackson, journalist and political analyst, and he's joining us live from Berlin. Thanks very much for taking our time and joining us here on WION, Mr. Jackson.
Thanks for having me.
I want to first seek your assessment as to how do you see the two wars, which are the Ukraine-Russia war, which has entered its third year, and the ongoing Israel-Hamas war affecting Europe and the West?
I think it's interesting that Borrell has brought up the security implications for both of these wars, because there are definitely some people in Europe who don't see them as our wars and who see them as, quite far away. Particularly in his home country of Spain, which is geographically quite a lot further from both of these fronts. And I think while Borrell is correct, and I think it's widely accepted that Ukraine has implications for Europe's security, not so many people are saying that about the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. And I think that's actually very interesting that he's made the link so explicit. But then Borrell is one of the voices in the European Union who's been most critical of Israel. I think he's asking if Israel creates this much damage, does that in Gaza, does that destabilize the whole region? Could we see a new refugee crisis, which we saw in 2015 after the Syrian civil war? And that was a huge deal for Europe's security and particularly for domestic politics.
But Mr. Jackson, Borrell also says that the two wars has put Europe in danger. Talk to us about the consequences of these wars on Europe.
Well, Europe was felt very safe for a long time. We thought we had entered the end of history, to quote Francis Fukuyama, where there were no more wars that would happen and we could deal with just trading with our partners. And yes, there were tensions, but actually everything would be getting better and liberal democracy was winning. I think what we've seen in Russia and Ukraine shows that is absolutely not guaranteed. Russia has become increasingly authoritarian domestically, while it's also, in the words of Borrell, it's a nuclear power which spends 30% on defense, and they're extremely resilient. So Russia it's expansionist, and it's a major threat for European security because they've shown they're willing to do what is necessary to try and win their aggressive war of conquest in Ukraine, where they've committed countless war crimes, something which I documented for the BBC Radio 4 in a documentary that's available online called Investigating Russia's War Crimes, where I spoke to a number of female investigators who are active in Ukraine and also Poland, talking to refugees and internally displaced people to try and paint a picture of the scale of the war crimes which Russia has committed and Russian soldiers have committed, and also find a way to prosecute both individuals and Russia as a nation, including getting Vladimir Putin to The Hague. But I think, one thing we saw, which was obvious from the beginning, that's not easy. That's not an easy task, especially, and the better Russia does, this is something that Borrell said, the worse that is for Europe. He's questioned, do we want Russian troops on the border with Poland and Russia to control 30% of the grain market? Now, I don't think we do, and I don't think anybody wants that, but he's sort of shadow boxing with figures, intellectually with figures like Olaf Scholz, who has made it clear that he doesn't want Russia to win, but he hasn't made it clear that he wants Ukraine to win. So many people in Europe, especially in Germany, where I join you from, have raised the question, what if Ukraine does too well? What if they beat the Russians too much? And I think Borrell is arguing that we need to support Ukraine as much as possible, not just so that they don't lose, but so that they can actually win and that Russia and troops go back to the Russian borders.
But Mr. Jackson, White House says that major obstacles have been resolved in terms of Hamas insisting on a full withdrawal of the Israeli forces and an end to the war. Now, the US President Joe Biden says that a ceasefire is possible by Monday. What is your assessment of this? Do you see a truce deal happening next week?
I think it's possible, absolutely. But we have to be honest and say that any ceasefire will already have seen countless lives lost on both sides, as well as the near devastation of Gaza. And so whatever this ceasefire is, it will also be temporary, even if it's called a permanent ceasefire, until they reach a two-state solution and a durable solution in the region. And that's actually very unlikely, I think, particularly with the Benjamin Netanyahu's government, who are many figures of whom are very extreme, and Netanyahu himself, who has effectively said that he's going to block a two-state solution, and there's been indications that the Israelis want to annex the northern part of Gaza, perhaps all of Gaza, as well as driving, ethnically cleansing Palestinians into Egypt via the Rafah border. So I think it's really hard to see what a long-term and durable solution will be. Whether there is a pause in the fighting or a sustainable ceasefire on Monday, I think everyone, particularly the families of Israeli hostages, Israeli society, and of course Palestinians as well, there and in the diaspora, will be extremely grateful for a ceasefire. But I think the damage has really been done, both to the region and potentially also for European security.
Yeah, just to add to that, there have at least been 30,000 deaths in Gaza, while 1,200 on the Israeli side. My last question to you, Mr. Jackson. What is your take on Borrell emphasizing, rather asserting, on how important it is to strengthen Europe's ties with the global south?
If I'm honest here, I think Europe absolutely does need to do that, but I'm not sure how much Borrell is really putting this into practice and how much he's just saying something, because there is a question of Europe isolating itself while particularly through support for Israel, where many countries in the global south are very hostile to Israel, and figures like Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, really strongly supported Israel, particularly at the start of this conflict. So there's a real worry in the EU and in Europe that they're gambling away support in the global south for supporting Israel. I think India, where you are based, is a bit of an exception to that rule, where many Indians kind of identify with Israel for various reasons. But I think Borrell, there's this question that Europe's not necessarily the leader of the world anymore, along with the US and the global south, which is also a very diffuse term, which sums up many billions of people. So I think we should be a little bit careful with that term. How much is Europe actually invested in building those alliances?
Right.
And is it doing it bilaterally, or is it doing through values, or is it doing through trade or aid? And actually Europe, I think, hasn't been so active, whereas individual countries, the UK, Germany, France, are more invested in aid, but it's bilateral rather than between different blocs.
Right, Mr. Jackson, thanks very much for taking our time and joining us here on WION.
Thank you for having me.